It is 6:30 on the morning of the 25th of December 1915, and Captain Sir Iain Colquhoun of the 1st Scots Guards is standing to in a firing trench near Ypres, watching a grey dawn creep over ground that a year earlier had briefly, impossibly held its breath. The Germans are quiet, too quiet perhaps for a man who has spent the last 12 months being told, in writing and in person, that there will be no repeat of what happened here in 1914. Then, at 9 o'clock, a sentry runs to him with word that German soldiers are standing on their parapets. Colquhoun goes forward. Across the wire, a German officer is waiting, and he asks, politely, for a truce. Colquhoun refuses. But the officer asks for something smaller, 3/4 of an hour to bury his dead. Colquhoun agrees. And in that half hour, something happens that no general on either side had sanctioned, and that both high commands would spend the rest of the war trying to make people forget. Men who had been killing each other for a year stood in the open, buried their comrades side by side, and then, cigarettes and cigars changing hands, talked. When the whistle blew, they went back to their trenches and started shooting again. Everybody knows the story of the Christmas truce of 1914, the carols, the football, the handshakes in no man's land that have since become one of the most retold moments of the entire First World War. Almost nobody knows that it happened again the following year, that it happened in more than one place, and that when it did, the machinery of the British and German armies moved with real urgency to bury it. This is the story of the truce that was not supposed to exist, the one the generals stamped out, the one the censors cut from letters home, and the one that very nearly vanished from history altogether. To understand why 1915 mattered so much more than 1914 ever could, you first have to understand what had changed in the space of exactly 12 months. In December 1914, the war was still young enough to feel like an aberration, a temporary derangement that decent men on both sides expected to end any day. The British Expeditionary Force that first Christmas was a small professional army, many of its men more used to peacetime soldiering than industrial slaughter, and the front line was thin enough and quiet enough in places that fraternization could spread almost unchecked. Senior commanders were embarrassed by it, certainly, but taken by surprise, and by the time reports reached London and Berlin, the truce was already over. There was no mechanism in place to prevent it because nobody had imagined it could happen. A year later, everything about the war had hardened. The volunteer armies of Kitchener's Call had arrived in their hundreds of thousands, men hungry to prove themselves and largely innocent of what awaited them, while the veterans of 1914 who survived had watched friends die in numbers that made goodwill towards the enemy feel, to many, like a betrayal. The battles of 1915, Neuve-Chapelle, Aubert Ridge, Loos, had cost the British alone tens of thousands of casualties for gains measured in yards, and the deadlock that the truce of 1914 had briefly interrupted was now understood, on both sides, to be permanent. Commanders no longer regarded a friendly Christmas as a charming irregularity. They regarded it as a threat to discipline itself, evidence that the ordinary soldier, left to his own devices, might simply decide the war was not worth fighting. Sir Douglas Haig had taken command of the British Expeditionary Force only days before, on the 19th of December 1915, succeeding Sir John French, and one of his first priorities was to ensure that nothing resembling the events of the previous Christmas would happen on his watch. Firm orders went down through every level of the chain of command, reminding units in explicit terms of the unauthorized truce of 1914 and stating flatly that nothing of the kind was to be permitted this year. Divisional and brigade commanders in several sectors went further still, instructing that any German soldier who showed himself above the parapet was to be shot on sight. The German army issued its own prohibitions, threatening severe punishment for any soldier who visited enemy lines, agreed to a ceasefire, or exchanged so much as a word or a souvenir with the men opposite. On paper, the problem had been solved. The war machine had identified its point of failure and moved to close it. What nobody in either high command had quite reckoned with was that soldiers, even soldiers under direct written orders, do not always behave like machines. The men who found a way around those orders were not committing some grand act of pacifist defiance. They were, for the most part, simply cold, tired, and unable to shake the memory of what Christmas had meant the year before. In the sector near Frelinghien, on the French-Belgian border, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers was holding the line under the command of Captain Clifton Stockwell. Opposite them, in trenches that ran close enough that voices carried across no man's land after dark, was a Jaeger battalion under Captain Friedrich Freiherr von Sinner. On Christmas Eve, according to accounts that would not surface publicly for decades, the Germans began singing and lighting candles along their parapet, much as they had in 1914, and an exchange of shouted greetings gradually became something more concrete. Stockwell and von Sinner met in no man's land itself, and between them they arranged an exchange of beer, Christmas puddings, and compliments conducted with the same careful, almost ceremonial courtesy that had marked the 1914 truce, two officers agreeing, in defiance of everything written above them, that this one day would be different. What makes the mechanics of this second truce so striking is how deliberately quiet it was kept. Unlike the events of 1914, which spread rapidly along stretches of the front and were reported, however patchily, in newspapers within a fortnight, the truces of 1915 were isolated, small in scale, and almost immediately suppressed by the men who took part in them as much as by the authorities above them. Soldiers who wrote home about it knew, by this point in the war, precisely what the military censor would do to such a letter, and many simply did not risk it. Where accounts survive at all, they survive because a letter slipped past the censor's pencil, or because a diary was kept privately and only read by family members decades later. In the case of Colquhoun's Scots Guards, the story survives because Colquhoun himself kept a diary, and because the incident escalated into something serious enough to generate a paper trail that no amount of institutional embarrassment could fully erase. Word of what had happened reached Lord Cavan, the division commander, who was, in his own words, furious that his explicit orders had been disobeyed. Colquhoun was court-martialed the following month. The mechanism of military justice, the very system Haig had set in motion to prevent exactly this kind of episode, was now required to process the fact that it had happened anyway on the watch of an officer with an otherwise spotless record in a sector where the orders had been unambiguous. It is a strange, almost bureaucratic irony. The truce of 1915 is better documented in some respects precisely because the army built the apparatus to punish it, and that apparatus left behind the evidence that the truce had occurred at all. It is worth pausing on how differently the two truces were received the moment news of them threatened to leak. In 1914, once rumors reached the neutral American press and the New York Times ran the story on the 31st of December, the British authorities found themselves outmaneuvered. The public appetite for the story was simply too great, and London capitulated within the first week of January, lifting its own embargo rather than be seen suppressing what was, by then, being read as a heartwarming curiosity rather than a breach of discipline. No such leniency was extended a year later. The apparatus of censorship had matured considerably over 12 months of total war, and letters describing anything resembling fraternization were far more likely to be quietly destroyed than passed for publication. Soldiers themselves had absorbed the lesson. Many who took part in the smaller truces of 1915 seem to have understood, without needing to be told twice, that writing home about it in plain language was no longer safe, and so the historical record depends disproportionately on private diaries never intended for publication, and on the occasional letter that slipped through by luck rather than official sanction. This is why the story survives at all in such fragments. Not because it mattered less to the men who lived it, but because the system built to prevent a repeat of 1914 also, almost as a side effect, prevented the story of that repeat from ever properly being told. The operational reality of these episodes, so far as it can be reconstructed, is one of small numbers and brief windows rather than the mass fraternization of the year before. At Frelinghien, the exchange between Stockwell and von Sinner appears to have lasted no more than an hour or two, confined to the officers and a handful of men rather than spreading down the length of the line. Near Ypres, Colquhoun's truce with the German officer lasted by his own account well under an hour, long enough to bury the dead of both sides and share a smoke, not long enough for the kind of organized football matches and gift exchanges that had made 1914 so widely remembered. Other sectors saw no truce at all, and some saw the opposite. Along part of the line near Wolvergam, German soldiers raised a small Christmas tree, complete with candles, above their parapet in a clear echo of the previous year's gesture. British gunners shot it down within minutes. Corporal Pankhurst, serving with the artillery of the 56th Division, later recalled that his batteries fired hundreds of shells that Christmas Day, not because there was any tactical purpose to it, but, as the men themselves believed, specifically to discourage any fraternization by keeping the guns loud and the mood hostile. One British soldier described it afterwards as a Christmas present for Fritz, delivered with grim irony. The psychological effect of this deliberate barrage should not be understated. Where the silence of 1914 had allowed carol singing to carry across no man's land and drawn men out of their trenches almost against their better judgment, the noise of 1915 was engineered specifically to prevent that silence from ever settling. It worked in most places. The truce, where it survived at all, did so only in isolated pockets where individual officers or NCOs made a private decision to look the other way, and where the men on both sides had, for whatever reason, shared exhaustion, a lingering sense of common humanity, simple bloody-mindedness, decided that this one day would not be governed by orders from the rear. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The contrast with the German side of the ledger is instructive. German High Command had issued its own prohibition on fraternization as early as the 29th of December 1914, within days of the first truce, showing an institutional nervousness that in some ways outpaced the British response. By 1915, both armies had converged on broadly the same solution: written orders, threats of court-martial, and, in the British case at least, the deliberate use of artillery as a tool of psychological discipline rather than tactical necessity. Where the two sides diverged was in what happened after the orders were broken. The German command, so far as the record shows, treated isolated fraternization as a disciplinary embarrassment to be quietly handled and forgotten, in keeping with a wider pattern of not wanting such stories to spread among troops already weary of the war. The British response to Colquhoun's case was, in one sense, harsher and in another far more forgiving. He was formally reprimanded following his court-martial, a real professional black mark, and one that could easily have ended a career. And yet the reprimand was very swiftly quashed by Haig himself, who by every indication wanted as little written record of the whole affair as possible. Colquhoun went on to serve for the rest of the war and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, his career essentially undamaged. It is a telling detail. High Command did not want a martyr, and it certainly did not want a public trial that might draw fresh press attention to the very possibility it was trying to extinguish. Compare that with the fate of the story itself. The 1914 truce, once it broke into print via the neutral American press before the British authorities gave way and lifted their own news embargo in early January, became almost impossible to suppress entirely. Too many men had taken part, too many letters had already gone out, and the story had a kind of charm that made it hard to be seen punishing. The 1915 truces had no such protection. They were smaller, more scattered, easier to bury administratively, and the wartime censorship apparatus by that point was more practiced and more thorough than it had been a year before. Word of the Frelinghien exchange between Stockwell and von Sinner did not properly surface until the early 1930s, more than 15 years after the armistice, and it was only in the last decade or so, in no small part thanks to the centenary commemorations of the First World War, that a detailed account of it has been reconstructed at all. The wider impact of the 1915 truce is necessarily harder to assess than that of its famous predecessor, precisely because so little of it survives in the official record. Where the 1914 truce is thought to have involved perhaps as many as 100,000 men along roughly two-thirds of the 30-mile front held by the British Expeditionary Force, the 1915 episodes described here appear to have involved, at most, a few hundred men across no more than a handful of sectors, a fraction of a fraction, and yet its significance lies less in scale than in what it reveals about the limits of military authority over the individual conscience. Haig's orders were about as explicit as orders can be. Threats of summary punishment had been made on both sides, and still, in at least two documented instances, officers with everything to lose chose a shared Christmas pudding and a handful of cigars over strict obedience. That tells you something about the durability of ordinary human decency even inside an institution built for the opposite purpose. And it tells you something rather less comfortable about how thoroughly institutions can, if they choose, write such moments out of memory. The suppression worked. For decades, the popular understanding of the Christmas truce began and ended in 1914, treated as a single, unrepeatable miracle, which made for a tidier story, in truth, than the messier reality of an event that briefly recurred against direct orders and was then quietly disappeared by the very men who had given those orders. There would be no widespread ceasefire on the Western Front again until the guns finally fell silent with the armistice of November 1918, by which point the war had killed some 7 million people and left 21 million more seriously wounded. Surviving physical traces of the 1915 events are scarce. A diary entry here, a court-martial record there, a handful of letters that slipped the censor. But the site at Frelinghien has, in the century since, become a place of quiet pilgrimage, and in December 2014, the grandsons of Stockwell and von Sinner met on the very same ground where their grandfathers once exchanged beer and puddings, watched by soldiers of both nations in a gesture that closed a circle nobody had ever officially been permitted to draw. Return, for a moment, to that half-hour near Ypres, to Colquhoun standing before a German officer who has just asked him for peace and been refused, and settled instead for the much smaller mercy of burying his dead. That half-hour is, in miniature, everything this story has to teach. It was not sanctioned. It was not celebrated. It generated no newspaper headlines, no post-war mythology, no annual commemorations for the better part of a century. It generated a court-martial, a reprimand, and a determined institutional effort to make sure it was never spoken of again. And it happened anyway. The Christmas truce of 1914 endures in memory because it was allowed to be remembered, reported quickly enough, widely enough, and with enough charm that punishing it seemed worse than tolerating it. The truces of 1915 endure only because a handful of documents escaped the fire that both armies, in their different ways, tried to set beneath them. Where 1914 was a spontaneous eruption that caught an unprepared high command off guard, 1915 was an act of quiet defiance carried out by men who knew exactly what they were risking and did it regardless. Which arguably makes it the braver story, even if it is the one nobody tells. Two armies had learned in the space of a single year exactly how dangerous a moment of shared humanity could be to the machinery of war, and they had built, with orders and artillery and court-martial paperwork, a wall specifically designed to stop it happening again. For an hour, in at least two places, that wall did not hold. Colquhoun buried the German dead and shook a stranger's hand. Stockwell and von Sinner shared a Christmas pudding across a line neither man had chosen to draw. Then the whistle blew, the wall went back up, and the war swallowed the story whole for the best part of 100 years. It was smaller than 1914. It was quieter than 1914. And because almost nobody was allowed to remember it, it very nearly disappeared. Which is precisely why it deserves, at last, to be told.